So I am pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Stephen Batchelor. Stephen has trained extensively in multiple Buddhist lineages. He was ordained for 10 years as a Buddhist monk, and he's now based in France. He's written a number of very well-known books that many of you may have read or at least heard of. Confession of a Buddhist Atheist and Buddhism Without Beliefs, and he's also the author of a new book that he has here called After Buddhism, Rethinking the Dharma for a Secular Age. So.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I was here, how long ago? 3 years ago, in this very room. And maybe some of you were too. The theme of this presentation will be Early Buddhism for a Secular Age, and it is rather shamelessly connected with the promotion of this book, which we'll see also on the video. And I'm in America at the moment, traveling around the country or across the country to read and to talk about this work, and hopefully to sell oodles of copies, which may or may not happen. But in any case, let's just try to frame what's going on in this time we find ourselves, this secular time. I realize we probably all have different ways of understanding that term. But also I need to frame it in terms of my own 40 plus years of engagement with Buddhism, or the Dharma, as I would far prefer to call it. And my practice, as was mentioned, started as a Tibetan Buddhist monk in the Gelugpa tradition, where I trained with Geshe Rabten and other lamas. I then did a 4-year training in Korean Son, or Zen. And since I've been back in the West, my interest has largely focused on the practice of Vipassana, mindfulness, and so on, and an ongoing study of the discourses primarily within the Pali Canon. And this has been, I'm not an academic. I don't have any credentials to be here, really. I have no university degree. I've never been to university or college. My training has always been in the context of living traditions. I can't, in good faith, consider a classical Buddhist text as though it is an object of scientific scrutiny. I read and ponder and engage with these texts in order to hear what they have to say to my own personal condition and the condition of our times. And from my Tibetan teacher's point of view, my progress in Buddhism over these years has, strictly speaking, been a regress, where having started with the Vajrayana and then downgraded to the Mahayana, and then downgraded further to the Hinayana. And now I'm feeling I'm sort of just going off the map from that categorization altogether to consider what is now increasingly being called early Buddhism. Again, this is probably understood in different ways, but broadly speaking, early Buddhism would be those teachings of the Buddha that are, broadly speaking, found in the Pali Nikayas, but also in their Chinese equivalents. We also have some of them translated into Tibetan. But let's just stay with the Pali Nikayas for the time being. And I'm particularly interested in those teachings that, which are attributed to the historical Buddha, but which cannot really be derived, as far as we can tell, from the Indian culture, religious framework, philosophy of his period. In other words, what I'm looking for are those teachings which seem to be original and distinctive to this historical person who taught these practices, these systems of ethics and philosophy in the conditions of his seculum, of his age, as a person living in that time in India all those hundreds of years ago. And I feel, and again I might be wrong of course, that the further we go back to the source, the closer we get to what we can reasonably reconstrue as the teachings of this man, strike me as having a degree of universality that is not perhaps the case in some of the orthodox Buddhist traditions that have been framed by Indian Brahmanic culture, or they've been framed by Chinese culture or Tibetan culture, which of course were also attempts to formulate Buddhist teaching and practice in a way that spoke to the needs and the conditions of people living in, let's say, 3rd century AD India, or 6th century AD China, or 12th century AD Tibet. So what is going on in our time is nothing at all different from what has gone on throughout Buddhist history. Buddhism for me is not primarily a metaphysical set of truth claims or a belief system or a set of dogmas that need to be preserved intact over the centuries, but rather it's a tradition of practice that addresses the core concerns, the core suffering of human beings, and in doing so is constantly being reinvented, re-articulated. And so when I talk about early Buddhism for secular times, I'm trying, through my own personal passions and needs, to recover some of these earliest strata of the Buddhist tradition, those that are not yet inflected so strongly by Indian, Chinese, Tibetan, and other cultural discourses, in order to articulate those core values and concerns to a world like the one we live in now, which we will loosely describe as secular. By secular, I don't just mean not religious. I think that's certainly the way the word is often used in popular discourse. But secular for me has its roots in the etymology of the word, seculum, which means our age, the kind of period in history that we currently inhabit. And for many people today, having been brought up in the social and political culture that stemmed from the European Enlightenment, from the suspicion of religious or revealed authority that likewise began in that period, and a world which of course nowadays is deeply informed by our understanding of the human being, the environment, the world we live in, from the natural sciences. This is a frame that's really quite different from any of the traditional frames of Asian cultures in which Buddhism has hitherto been articulated. I think also we are at a period where there is a beginning of another wave of interest and engagement with Buddhist teachings, and curiously, teachings that come from the earliest strata of the tradition. And much of this, I feel, is due to the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn, the whole mainstreaming of mindfulness. And just to give you an example of how this is playing out now, 2 weeks ago, in the British Houses of Parliament, the all-party Parliamentary Committee on Mindfulness, it exists, I didn't make that up, it's not a Monty Python joke, delivered its policy, a document of policy proposals to the British government, where they are advocating the use and the application of mindfulness in the fields of healthcare, education, the workplace, and the military. This will now be taken up by the different government departments and considered to see whether, in fact, this will be taken forward so that possibly in a few years' time, mindfulness will be part of the British national curriculum. It's already being employed in the National Health Service. There's possibilities likewise that it'll be brought into employment and labour fields and so forth and so on. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen. But if someone had told me this 40 years ago, when I was a young, idealistic Tibetan Buddhist monk in Dharamsala, that in 40 years' time the British government would be adopting Buddhist practices, and I would have thought they were completely bonkers, or fantasists, or people who had taken too many mind-altering substances. But it has come to pass. And I find that quite extraordinary. It's so extraordinary that I can't even quite fully compute or in a sense digest that this is happening. I would never have imagined it. In my own practice, after a number of years studying in the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism, well, 2 or 3 years actually, I'd just become a novice Buddhist monk. And for some reason, for reasons for which I still don't fully understand, His Holiness the Dalai Lama invited Satyanarayan Goenka, Mr. Goenka, to teach a 10-day Vipassana retreat in the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. And this was both for the young Tibetan monks who were at the dialectical school in Dharamsala and whoever of the Western students who were studying in the library. And the library was turned into a temporary 10-day retreat center. And I was very curious to know what this was all about. And I did this 10-day retreat. And for the first time, I was introduced to the practice of mindful attention, satipatthana, primarily focused on the breath, the body, the sensations within the body, and the Vedana, the feeling tones associated with that experience. And this for me was a completely transformative event. It introduced me for the first time to a form of practice that didn't involve reflections or concepts, it didn't involve visualizations, it didn't involve mantras. There was no intermediary medium through which I was engaging in meditation or practice, but I, for the first time, was given tools to concentrate and focus and still the mind and turn that attention in a completely uncompromising way to the primacy of my actual experience here and now. And since that point, that quality of attention has been the bedrock of all the practices I've done since, and it continues to be. And this is, of course, a practice going back to the Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the foundations of mindfulness in the Pali Canon, which likewise Mr. Goenka cited and introduced us to. And that had a profound transformative effect in my life. And I also, though, have to acknowledge that when I did that 10-day retreat, I had spent the last 2 or 3 years immersed in Buddhist philosophy / theology, the Dharma studies. I'd done a lot of Lamrim type reflections, which basically describe through a series of contemplations the structure of the Buddhist path. In other words, providing a vision of what human life is for, providing a vision of the core values, the core philosophical ideas. And I don't think that had I done that retreat without that framework, it would have had the effect that it did. In other words, it brought in an element that in a way grounded grounded my practice and my understanding of the Dharma in the felt experience of my moment-to-moment existence. So what I feel we somehow need today is that this practice of mindfulness be one that is embedded and understood within an ethical and a philosophical outlook. I don't think that necessarily need be Buddhist in any explicit way, but I do feel that if the integrity of the tradition is to, in a sense, bear its fullest fruit, that we need more than just the formal exercise of mindful attention. We need somehow to, in a way, do a similar kind of transformation to the Buddhist tradition in terms of an ethical and a philosophical framework that I think, again, is not something that is necessarily part of the Buddhist religion, but has also a universality about it that can likewise speak very directly to the conditions of our time and our age. Another practice that for me was very central in my own experience of the Dharma was the study of the koan, or the hwadu, as they call it. I learned this in South Korea, where I was a Buddhist monk for about 4 years, training in a monastery where for 6 months of the year, 3 months in the summer, 3 months in the winter, we would meditate for 10 to 12 hours a day, focusing entirely on the question, what is this? Now, it may not sound like everybody's idea of a lot of fun, but this came at a time in my life where that was precisely what I needed or felt I needed to do, something of that order. In other words, a meditation practice that's not just about paying attention, but a practice that seeks to embody the primary questions of what it means to be here at all, what we might call existential questions. What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to be fully human? What is this is more about cultivating a quality of curiosity, perplexity, wonder, awe, that is not just a transient sort of mental experience going on in the head, but is actually embodied, that you ask with your body and mind in such a way that you can let go of the words of the question and you can somehow bring that quality of mystery, of wonder, perplexity in such a way that it infuses one's consciousness of each moment. And that, I feel, is perhaps what we might, again, I'm not very fond of the word spiritual, but this to me is really the deep spiritual or religious question that lies at the root of these practices. I feel that this is, in Indian Buddhism, this is perhaps best expressed through the legend of the Buddha, the story of his growing up as a privileged prince inside a palace, then one day deciding he wants to see what's on the other side of those walls, and he encounters a sick person, an aging person, a corpse, and that enables him for the first time, so the legend goes, to become aware of the primary questions of his own existence. And I can only really understand the Buddha's awakening or enlightenment as a moment or a series of moments in which he arrived at a resolution of some kind to those primary existential questions. So I think that if the practice of mindfulness is to be further developed and contextualized, I feel that both the ethics, the philosophy, and also a deeper living or live sense of the sheer mystery of being a sentient being are somehow integrated into this process. Now, how this is going to be done, I honestly don't know. I don't think for a moment that it will be the work of any single person. I think it's very much a concern that I know I share with many of my colleagues and friends, to work towards this articulation of a vision, really, that perhaps will take, as these Buddhist movements have taken in the history of the tradition, it may take generations, I don't know. I feel that at our times we have far greater and more immediate access to teachings, to information, to data, particularly now with cyber technologies and so on. But I don't know whether the actual evolving of the Dharma is just a question of having more knowledge. I think of the Dharma in history as something more comparable to a living organism that adapts and evolves to changing circumstances in a kind of more organic, rather, in a much slower sense of time. It's not something certainly that will just be achieved by some clever person coming up with a brilliant theory. That might be necessary too, but for it to be a living thing in our secular age, it needs to be somehow digested, internalized, and articulated in forms that will perhaps only become evident over longer periods of time. I think also what is crucial in this process is the integration of the arts into the Dharma. I'm aware, of course, that there's a lot of discussion about Buddhism and science, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But I wish there were more reflection and discussion and communication between the Dharma and the imagination, particularly the creative imagination as it finds itself expressed through both the visual arts, poetry, literature, theatre, film, and so on. There are signs of this. Last couple of years ago, a novel was published by Ruth Ozeki, who is a Zen priest living on one of the islands off the west coast of Canada, called A Tale for the Time Being, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize about 2 years ago, and is a wonderful integration of Buddhist teaching, primarily from Dogen in this case, but embedded, I think, quite effortlessly and seamlessly into a contemporary literary narrative. And the fact that it was accepted in the mainstream of literary culture is indicative of these teachings somehow getting out of the ghetto of Buddhism and speaking to a much wider public, much in the same way that mindfulness has got out of the ghetto of Buddhism and is now engaging with people's lives elsewhere. But I'd like to spend the remaining 15 or so minutes that I have in this presentation by trying to consider how we might rethink the Dharma from the ground up. That was actually my original subtitle, but the publisher didn't like it. I think mainly because it's difficult to end a title on with the word up. It looks odd. In any case, that's probably a more accurate account of what it is I think I'm involved in and what many others likewise I think are considering. Again, this return to the early tradition is not for me hopefully subject to what's sometimes called the genetic fallacy, namely if it's earlier it's better and truer. because there's plenty of material in the Pali Canon that I don't think is terribly helpful. So it's a question of teasing out those early doctrines, most of which we'll find in all Buddhist traditions. They're not exclusive to that tradition. And the teaching that I feel almost without question is the one that people will regard as foundational to Buddhist thought and practice, is that of the Four Noble Truths. So how are we to consider these Four Noble Truths, these four truths, in a way that might allow us to think of them in a more secular frame, without reference to past and future lifetimes, without having to adopt the metaphysical belief, as I think it is, that craving or ignorance and craving are somehow the cause of reincarnation and keep us spinning around in the cycle of birth and death, which is implicit in the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths. I also don't think it's totally useful to try to psychologize that teaching and to think of craving as somehow generating a kind of psychological anguish or a sort of a mental suffering, and the rest of the suffering we can kind of just put to one side. My sense is that when we consider the Buddha's first discourse, which is called the Turning of the Wheel of Dhamma, although that's not the title given in the canon itself, when we get to the end of it, that discourse, it's very short, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, the Buddha recognizes that, and I'm going to quote from memory here, that only when my knowledge and vision was entirely clear about the 12 aspects of the Four Truths, could I consider myself to have attained a peerless awakening in this world. Now this, of course, is a very, I think, authoritative statement about the nature of awakening itself, or enlightenment. Awakening or enlightenment here is not understood as gaining a privileged contemplative insight into the nature of some ultimate truth, be it emptiness or the nature of mind or nirvana. But awakening is understood as understanding these 12 aspects of the Four Truths. What are these 12 aspects? Each of the Four Truths are to be recognized, performed, and accomplished, it says. In other words, each truth is to be related to in a particular way. It's not that all four truths are to be understood or known. But the first truth, that of dukkha, is to be embraced. The word is parinya, which means fully understood. The second of the truths, craving, is to be released or let go of, I would prefer. The third truth of the stopping of craving is to be realized, to be seen clearly and directly for oneself. And the fourth truth, that of the Eightfold Path, is to be brought into being, to be realized, to be cultivated in some way. Now, once we start to shift the focus from truths to these four tasks, we move from a truth-based metaphysic into a task-based ethic. And again, I'm using the word ethic here not as a synonym for morality, but I'm using the word ethic as it was used by the Greeks, which is really talking about a life of practice, not just spiritual practice, but an engagement with our life and the world that has seceded from our instinctive impulses, attachments, fears, drives, and so forth and so on, and chooses consciously to lead a human life that seeks to realize the values that are most central in our intuitive life, our communal life, in such a way that we achieve, or we aspire to achieve, becoming the sort of person we seek to be. Ethics comes from the Greek ethos, which means character. Ethics is about the practice of being human, the practice of emerging consciously into a person whose life, from the way he or she sees the world, makes ethical or moral choices, speaks and communicates, acts physically, engages in livelihood and work, focuses their energies, pays mindful attention, and develops concentration, which are, of course, the 8 steps of the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is an ethic in that sense. And if we think of the Four Truths in terms of being tasks, things to do, the whole practice is essentially ethical in that broader sense. And this ethos, this ethic, this practice begins with fully knowing dukkha. Now, dukkha we can loosely translate as suffering, but as the Buddha defines it in this first text, it clearly refers more than just to personal discomfort or pain. It has to do with the existential situation we find ourselves in. It has to do with birth, sickness, aging, death. It has to do, as he says at the end of the definition, with the 5 aggregates of clinging. In other words, the totality of our experience in all of its complexity in every single moment. How do we embrace that? How do we approach and understand and empathize and relate to this experience of life? Frankly, dukkha is, to me, almost synonymous with life, as we use the word life in English as, well, that's life. C'est la vie. Something unpleasant or painful happens and we say, well, that's life. Now, by life in that context, we don't mean biological life. We mean life in the sense of an experience that is inescapably shot through with a certain sense of the tragic. The English word, I think, also that works quite well here is poignancy. There's something very poignant to our lives. And the more we pay attention to these Buddhist ideas like impermanence, not self, the impersonality of our physical, mental life, we realize that however joyous a particular moment in our experience might be, that it will end, that there's something profoundly poignant about even the most joyous experiences that we can undergo. So I think we don't have time now, but you can of course read this at great length in my book. We can see that this idea of embracing or fully knowing dukkha is really entering into a very different relationship to our life in that sense. I think it has a cognitive element. I think it's important to pay attention to those features of our experience that we tend to ignore or overlook or deny, like impermanence and death. It also has an affective quality. In other words, it opens up another way of feeling about ourselves, feeling about others who, like ourselves, also suffer. And I would argue that it has an aesthetic dimension as well. I mean, a good example of that would be, why do we go to watch a play like Macbeth or Hamlet? This is very far from a screwball romantic comedy, which is a laugh a minute. In fact, these plays are bringing us into of contact with some of the deepest dilemmas and tragedies of our, well, they're called tragedies. Drama, for Aristotle, was always tragedy. And I feel that the arts, too, you see, are a wonderful medium for bringing us into this fully knowing of dukkha through theatre, in this case, or movies, or literature, and so on. And I think the West is has a very rich artistic tradition that is not reducible to mere entertainment, but is actually, for many people, the way that they enter into a more contemplative relationship with the very core issues of what it means to suffer. When we encounter a world, an environment, but be it a simple dispute we might have in our family, or some success we might be having at work, or simply we're walking through the countryside and enjoying the beautiful autumn fall leaves. We realize also that every experience provokes a kind of reaction within us. And these some reactions, of course, are wonderful. We experience a reaction of kindness or generosity or insight or wisdom. And of course, these qualities, again, universally human, are things that are integral to the practice and the path itself. These would constitute, the fourth task of cultivating the path. But the Buddha sees himself as a physician, as a doctor. His teaching is basically remedial and therapeutic. And so it focuses on those kinds of reactions that we have that don't get us anywhere, often cause an enormous amount of grief, and perhaps most importantly, I would argue, they prevent us from entering the stream of an ethical life. They keep us going round and round in habitual patterns of self-attachment, self-interest, almost a kind of narcissistic self-regard, and thereby stunt and stymie our actual potential for human flourishing. Again, this is a term taken from the Greeks, eudaimonia, which I think likewise is precisely what the Eightfold Path is about. But for this path to enable such flourishing, it means that we need to find freedom from those counter forces that block access to such a life. And these are often then known by a number of different terms in Buddhism. Perhaps the earliest one is the idea of the three fires: the fire of greed, the fire of hatred, and the fire of delusion or confusion. And I think the notion of fire, again, is very telling. In other words, when an organism encounters an attractive or an unattractive or a distressing or a pleasing object, that is like a match striking a matchbox and something flares up. Greed and hatred, etc., flare up within us. So the second task is the task of letting go of those destructive, negative habits of our organism. And again, these destructive, negative habits are only destructive in the sense that they prevent a full flourishing of what is humanly possible, but they are, of course, simply the legacy of our evolution, that they would now be understood as being embedded in our neurobiology. I've been told probably in the limbic system. I actually don't have a clue what the limbic system is, but that is apparently where they are. But what it points to is that these are things that we're not going to somehow be able to magically delete by doing enough meditation retreats. These are built into our organism. And they served enormous survival, they've been of enormous advantage to us in the process of surviving and evolving and becoming the kind of beings we are now. So the second task, rather than thinking of the second noble truth as craving is the origin of suffering, which is basically a metaphysical claim. I don't think it's really that much different from craving is from, God created heaven and earth, frankly. If we look at this in terms of it being something to do rather than something to believe or know, then it's a practice of letting go of this reactivity. But what does that mean? To let go of greed, to let go of hatred. Sometimes it's translated as abandon, which I think is rather too strong and has a very close affinity, to my mind, with some kind of aversive rejection. Whereas in the actual practice of attention and mindfulness, it's not got anything to do with trying to get rid of something. It has to do with learning to see these processes for what they are, to be able to bear witness, to experience the rising up of these patterns, but not to identify with them, not to get caught up in them, not to let them run the show, but instead cultivate an open, non-reactive space of awareness in which we can see them arise, and if they're left to their own devices, they will naturally fizzle out and come to an end. And the first discourse, in fact, concludes with the phrase, which was a sort of a slogan of the early Buddhist community: whatever is subject to arising is subject to ceasing. That, to me, is the very core of what this practice is about. In allowing these reactions to come to a stop, even momentarily, we open up a space of possibility in which we can think and speak and act in a way that's not conditioned by those habits and drives and patterns. And those moments of stopping are, in some sense, moments of nirvana. In other words, the absence of greed, of hatred, of confusion. Temporary perhaps, but nonetheless moments of potential freedom that are not an end in themselves, but they offer us the possibility of another beginning. They offer us the possibility of thinking, speaking, acting in a way that's no longer driven by these kinds of destructive habits of body and mind. And that's what leads us into the stream of the path itself, what the Buddha calls entering the stream. And then we have the potential to, in a sense, redefine, reconfigure how we live in our own thoughts, in our words, in our deeds. And that is the practice, that is the ethical practice. And in some way, all of these four tasks are totally interwoven one with the other. It's not as though they're four totally separate things. Embrace suffering, let go of craving, experience the stopping of craving, cultivate the path. For didactic purposes, yes, it's possibly helpful to think of them as discrete tasks or acts. But experientially, in living life from moment to moment, it might be more helpful to think of them as four aspects of a single task or a single practice. And in any case, I have to stop here. I don't know if you can read that at the back. This boils down to what I call ELSA. Embrace, let go, see or stop. I go back and forth with that one. And act. And this action, again, is not... I want to get out of this idea that we're considering this path as a linear progression from A to Z, but rather to think of this as something more akin to a positive feedback loop. Because if we embrace the condition we're in, we let go of the reactions, we see clearly the moments when those reactions are suspended or stopped, that allow the opportunity to act unconditioned by them, that brings us through speech, acts, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, concentration, back to the first task, embracing the condition we're in. What are we mindful and what do we concentrate on? We concentrate on what is unfolding in our life now. And so, like a positive feedback loop, we return to where we started, but at a deeper pitch, as it were. And that, to me, describes the evolution of this practice as one that is essentially ethical. It's in terms of what we do to, in the process of becoming the kind of person we aspire to be. And again, it might start as a personal practice. I think inevitably for most of us it will. But that can never be understood in isolation from a person who is inevitably a part of a community, of a society, of a race, of sentient beings. We are inevitably entangled one with the other, and as we again know from the natural sciences, that everything from carrots to ducks to human beings all stems from the same basic stuff of DNA. This is what unites us as living beings. And this practice is one, I would argue, is that of learning to become a practicing human, to make human being our practice. And once we can start to look at the Buddha's teaching in this way, there seems to be really little need for adhering to many of the classical religious doctrines of Buddhism. We enter into a form of practice that engages the whole of ourselves, that seeks meaning and value and purpose, that is healing and restorative, not just for ourselves, but for the world of which we are an intrinsic part. And that I would present to you as a tentative vision of how early Buddhism might be able to speak to the suffering of our secular age. Thank you. Well, we have, it's 5:30, so just a couple.
So if folks have questions.
Folks, yes, this folk. Yes, Sharon. Is there a roving mic or not? And I'll repeat the question. Yeah.
Okay, the question is, what religious practices are you thinking of that we can let go of once we have this kind of core secular vision? What would you think would kind of just fall away?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by religious practices. I think it's more a question of certain sort of views and opinions, particularly the elements, the basic classical Indian cosmology, multiple realms of existence, reincarnation, things like that. In that sense, I would envisage a practice that is concerned entirely with the suffering of this world. But I don't mean, and this is what I'm often misrepresented by, that I'm only actually interested in my own personal egotistic life and pleasures. No, it's about engaging with this world, not just as it is now or will be in our lifetime, but in how this world will hopefully continue to flourish long after our death. You see, I don't have any trouble with the idea of karma. The only issue I have with it is I don't think there's any need for Stephen to be around when the results of my and our actions play themselves out. The important thing is to be more aware and more conscious of how what we do now as individuals, as communities, as societies, as the human race, what consequences those actions will have in the future after our death. So it's not much different, really. I just don't see the need any longer to posit a reincarnating entity that somehow carries the seeds of these karmic acts that then ripen as some particular experience in my subsequent reincarnation as this, that, or other being. Rebirth, yeah. I think the two ideas of rebirth and karma are logically entirely separate. But they're often, in Buddhist orthodoxy, thought of almost as one thing. People say, karma and rebirth, as though it's one thing. It's not. So that would be one thing. The sort of the cosmological framework of ancient India, that can fall away, I would say. I see no need for it in my own practice. Some people will say, oh, well, then you're not a Buddhist. That's a fair point. I'm not a Buddhist in terms of adhering to the orthodoxies of any of the classical traditions. But on the other hand, my life is rooted, and the practice of my life is rooted, I feel, in a reading of the core values of the Buddhist tradition. So I'm not a Buddhist? Well, maybe not, in some respects. But I also feel myself to be religious in some ways. To me, these are matters of ultimate concern, as the theologian Tillich defined faith, the state of being ultimately concerned, to take these things with the deepest seriousness. Yes?
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of share your views on when skillful means become unskillful means, in the sense of taking Buddhist practices and removing them from the matrix of ideas that you've expounded, that they're no longer leading us towards that realization of the human potential.
Though the question has to do, when do skillful means become unskillful means?
Specifically about like the MBSR movement, corporate mindfulness movement, where so much has been stripped away. Or I think I should address those separately and ask what you think. At what point are Buddhist practices like cultivating sati being put in the service of just perpetuating
dukkha? So in what sense are Buddhist practices like the cultivation of sati, as in MBSR, corporate mindfulness, etc., being put in the service of self-aggrandizement and so forth and so on, and are losing touch with the core purposes that these practices were initially taught? Is that correct?
Yes.
I think this has always gone on. To spend one's... is it any more trivialization of the Buddhist tradition to reduce one's practice to chanting, Om Mani Padme Hum, or Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, or Om Amida Butsu? Isn't this also dumbing down a rich tradition and turning it into a simple kind of, in this case, consolatory mantra of some kind? This is how human beings do things. We take what is very rich, complex philosophy and ethical system, and we boil it down to something which, in some ways, looks kind of, has little to do with that complex, rich system. I think, in some ways, MBSR has become the Om Mani Padme Hum of secular Buddhism, in a way. And I don't, you see, I work as a meditation teacher. I spend half my year teaching people on usually 7-day retreats, loosely under the rubric Vipassana, but I bring in a bit of Zen to sort of spice it up. And what I find is that so many people now have had an experience of mindfulness, maybe in a corporate setting, who knows. But what a certain percentage of people who do these practices find is that mindfulness, MBSR, for example, does not just solve a particular problem you're struggling with in your personal life. It might. But it also introduces you to a whole new way of experiencing yourself, experiencing the world. It gives you the first taste of the stopping of reactivity, meaning that the very core as I understand it, of MBSR, is learning to step back, to see what's going on, and not identifying and getting caught up in it. But that, I would argue, is at the very heart of at least my reading of the Four Noble Truths. Mindfulness is not some marginal Buddhist practice that was, that was in a few monasteries in Outer Mongolia, but it's right there in the Eightfold Path. It's at the very core. So what I meet, all the time, people who have the experience of mindfulness in whatever context, also opens up their lives in which they can witness and experience themselves from another perspective altogether. And this very often then allows the freedom and the stillness to begin to become more sensitized to the very questions of their life. What does it mean to work in this corporation, let's say? Ethical issues often emerge quite naturally from this experience. And people nowadays, they Google mindfulness, they realize, hey, it's a Buddhist meditation tradition, and they're drawn into deepening that practice, that cultivation, in such a way that they are looking for a more explicit ethic, philosophy of life, a greater sense, maybe a spiritual or a religious sense of the mystery and wonder of life. All of these things begin to happen. And so I think it's very difficult to say this is skillful means or unskillful means. You can only really judge it in terms of its long-term effects. As they say in the sutras, it is by their fruits that ye shall know them. Whether it's, yes?
Sorry if this is going to be like early basic questions.
That's okay.
But,
they're usually the best ones.
Okay. So in Buddhism, there's this idea of, like you said, understanding your emotions and separating yourself from them and realizing that they are not you. I have trouble understanding that while still being really secular and really understanding and enjoying science, because what goes through my mind when I try to do those things is, but there are these neurons happening in my body that are happening because this person affected me this way, and these feelings are me, they're not separate from me. And so how do you make compatible the idea of recognizing your feelings and not getting caught up in them, like you said, but still recognizing that your feelings are you, like literally they are you?
Well, again, I think the important thing is, you see, I think it's helpful to sort of tease apart these different aspects of the practice and not to think that it's all reducible to one thing. There are moments, I think, moments that can be very liberating to stop, to pay attention, and to notice that what you thought of as somehow intrinsically, what I thought of as intrinsically Stephen, I didn't even think of it that way. It's just these feelings, these emotions, these are, I am angry, I desire this, in such a way that there's no opportunity or freedom to actually say, well, wait a minute, this is an emotion, it's coming out of my body, it's coming out of my neurons in my brain, and it's having this consequence, and I'm buying into what it's telling me, I'm buying into that story. I do think it helps, and I think this is, you'll find not only in Buddhism, but in a great deal of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. It's all very much giving us a still, balanced state in which we come to evaluate ourselves more objectively. But if that were the end of the practice, if that's what it was all about, I agree with you. I don't think it would take us very far. We could sort of dwell in this state, it's not me, it's not me, it's not me. But that would not exactly enable you to flourish as a person. So in other words, that's step 2, step 3. But in order for that insight to translate into a way of life that you, and you alone, are living, that you are becoming, the sort of person you're becoming, you need that distance in order to make that cessation, what Buddhists call renunciation, as it were, in order to embark on a life that is genuinely and truly your own. I find one of the interesting passages we find in the Pali, or sentences, is this term that when you enter this path, you become independent of others in the teaching. You become autonomous in your practice. Remember one of the very famous last statements of the Buddha, be an island to yourself, atta. It's the same word, self. It's not saying be an island to your no self. In fact, you, yourself, is your refuge. The Buddha also, there's a passage in the Dhammapada where the Buddha says that the pandita, the wise person, should train the self, or train him or herself, like a farmer irrigates a field, like a arrowsmith fashions an arrow, like a carpenter shapes a piece of wood. In other words, the self is not negated, but is actually understood as a kind of work in progress, something that you can irrigate, fashion, shape, form. And I think by returning to those kinds of metaphors, rather than getting, in a sense, sort of locked into this idea that, in Buddhism there is no self, I think can perhaps be more fruitful and helpful, at least in this particular secular model that we're trying to work out. One last question, then I think we have to stop. Yes?
In your book, are we going to read about Buddhism as sort of countercultural phenomenon, or are we going to read about it?
In this book,
Yeah.
are we going to read about Buddhism and countercultural
We're not
phenomena?
only a secular age, but we're a capitalist age.
Uh-huh.
We are mainstream America, mainstream China, mainstream India. There are some powerful forces that are trying to satisfy everybody's greeds and claim that people. So I just wonder if you imagine this future for Buddhism being mainstream or countercultural.
I see it as being profoundly countercultural. I don't get into that in any great detail here. I don't offer a political manifesto. I do offer some theses of secular Buddhism at the very end. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, I made a presentation to the All-Party Parliamentary Committee on Mindfulness. And there was a Labour member of Parliament. Labour in England is sort of socialist, left-wing. And his concern was that if people actually started practicing mindfulness, it would have an effect on the economy. And this might be one of the reasons the government might not be so enthusiastic about it at the end of the day, because if people learn to be content, if people learn to actually enjoy watching their breath, then they're not going to go and spend their spare time in the shopping malls. And if they don't spend their spare time in the shopping mall spending lots of money, then people who make the goods that we don't really need are going to find themselves out of a job. And these people are then going to vote for the sort of people who stand up for workers' rights, like the Labour Party. The knock-on effects, I think, are potentially very, very profound. So in that regard, no, I think the idea that mindfulness is somehow oiling the wheels of capitalism, that might at some superficial level be the case. But as I mentioned to this gentleman, I think if you take these practices to heart, you begin to reassess your whole sense of what it means to find contentment and well-being. And we know from these sorts of practices that, and I think one of the great things about going on a retreat is you're perfectly happy sitting there, walking up and down or looking at your breath or just being present in just the extraordinary fact of being alive. And so I feel this would lead to a life of greater simplicity, a life in which we don't think we can only find happiness through endless repeated gratification of our desires and senses. So I think this is subversive, not just in terms of our psychological habits, but potentially in terms of how we live as societies. That's maybe a good point to end. Thank you very much.